Hello and welcome to The Game Changers, the podcast that celebrates trailblazing women in sport. I'm Sue Anstiss, and I'd like to start with a big thank you to our partners Sport England, who support The Game Changers through a National Lottery Award. I'm delighted to say that this, the 13th season of the podcast, is a serialisation of my book, Game On, The Unstoppable Rise of Women's Sport. Chapter 11, He for She. It is by standing up for the rights of girls and women that we truly measure up as men. Desmond Tutu, South African cleric and theologian. This book charts the unstoppable rise of women's sport, with many trailblazing, game-changing women leading the charge. But ultimately, having men on side will be essential if true equality in sport is ever to be achieved. For the last 150 years, men have held the power in sport, whether that's making governance decisions in sports organisations, bringing money to the table as sponsors and investors, or deciding what gets covered in the media. As women have discovered in many battles for equality throughout the decades, we can be hugely effective at creating change, but having men backing our cause can have an enormous impact too. In researching male allies in sport, I found the concept of a continuum of allyship fascinating. At one end of the scale, there are those men who absolutely appreciate why gender equality in sport is good for everyone and are happy to throw their weight behind positive change in this area, to be vocal and use their influence. Then there are the men who respect women in positions of leadership, are not sexist in their behaviour, and would not preclude women from opportunities, but they are unlikely to call others out or question the system. Next are the men who are just happy with the way things are, who don't want to rock the boat and think men probably do a better job at most things than women. Finally, at the other end of the spectrum, are what might have been known as the male, pale and stale brigade, the men who strongly feel that sport is a male domain and women should be excluded and prevented from progress and influence. In any talk of male allies for women's sport, the first person who often springs to mind is Andy Murray, who has constantly used his profile to publicly call out sexism when he sees it in sport. One of my favourite clips, which received worldwide coverage at the time, is from Wimbledon in 2017. Andy has just been defeated in the quarter-final by American player Sam Querrey, and is in the post-match press conference with a bank of microphones before him. A reporter wants to know what this might mean for US tennis. Andy, Sam is the first US player to reach a major semi-final since 2009. How would you describe male player? Says Andy under his breath. I beg your pardon? Male player, right? Oh yes, the first male player, that's for sure. The nervous chuckling and mutters of acknowledgement you can hear in the room are incredibly powerful, as is the fact that Andy does not smile or offer any sympathy to the journalist for his faux pas. Judy Murray tweeted the clip that evening with the words, "That's my boy," and a heart emoji. Wonderful stuff. Talking of casually sexist journalists, at the Rio Olympics in 2016, Murray was interviewed by broadcaster John Inverdale, who congratulated the tennis player on becoming the first person ever to win 2 Olympic tennis gold medals. With more good humour on this occasion, he had just won the Olympic gold after all, Murray corrects Inverdale, pointing out that both Serena and Venus Williams had achieved the feat before him. I think Venus and Serena have won about 4 each, he laughs. In 2014, Andy chose former world number 1 Amelie Mauresmo to be his new coach. He said at the time, "When I was young, every coach around me was a man. Every single one. I just looked at the positives Amelie could bring, and I couldn't see any negatives at all. Amelie was the best in the world at what she did, and whether you're a man or a woman, or in any sport or job, that's an incredibly difficult thing to do. You have to have amazing qualities to do that. Despite this support, Amelie received lots of sexist comments, with Australian tennis player Marinko Matosevic saying it was just a politically correct decision, adding, "Someone's got to give it a go. It won't be me." Andy responded with a column in L'Equipe, the French sports paper, where he defended his coach and declared himself a feminist. He pointed out that his former male coaches never had to deal with the kind of scrutiny Marismo received, which wasn't right. Have I become a feminist? Well, if being a feminist is about fighting so that a woman is treated like a man, then yes, I suppose I have, he wrote. In a piece for the BBC in 2017, he explained, "I've never set out to be a spokesperson for women's equality. Inequality is something I started to see and become passionate about. It's opened my mind. I've actually become very passionate about getting more women in sport, giving women more opportunities. When I was younger, I wasn't thinking about stuff like that, but now I've seen it with my own eyes. It's quite amazing how few female coaches there are across sport. And on top female tennis players' commitment to the sport, they make those same sacrifices and are as determined and committed to winning as any of the top men on the tour." I asked Judy Murray about her son's consistent comments, and she told me, "It makes such a big impact when he does, or when a man speaks out on behalf of the women. It makes much more impact than when one of the top women does it. Sadly, this is just the case. High-profile men calling out the sexism they see in sport can have a massive impact." In 2019, when Manchester City manager Pep Guardiola was interviewed ahead of a big game, the journalist said, "Tomorrow, you've got the prospect of winning the first ever domestic treble in this country." "Men's," Guardiola said immediately. The reporter just continued, "How much does that prospect of making history excite you?" Guardiola smiled and took a breath. The first time men's. Women. They won it. Sometimes simply giving women's sport airtime and profile can be a hugely powerful role of a male ally. When David Beckham took his daughter, Harper, to watch England women, Alex Scott wrote in The Sun, "David Beckham took Harper to watch England in the Women's World Cup because he wanted to support the Lionesses, not for a PR stunt. We all want to see dads at football with their daughters, and seeing David Beckham high-fiving his 7-year-old Harper in the stands at Stade d'Ocean on Thursday was so powerful. It normalises it. Beckham was there because he wanted to be, not because there was someone in his ear telling him to go. He already gets the connection with women's football. I remember meeting him when I was playing for Team GB, and he would often send us good luck messages." The same goes for Ian Wright. We had lunch together yesterday, and he's out here in France because he wants to support the Lionesses too. In the US, one of the highest profile male allies for female sport was former LA Laker Kobe Bryant. His advocacy and support for future and current WNBA athletes was much celebrated in the wake of his death in January 2020. It was very common to see the 5-time NBA champion sitting courtside at WNBA games with his young daughter Gianna, who also aspired to play professionally but so tragically died in the same helicopter accident as her dad and 7 others. What Bryant did most powerfully was to give credence to the women's game. He created interest, making male sports fans curious to know why an all-time NBA star found so much joy and pleasure in women's basketball. He spent time with WNBA players and treated them as equals. He would casually mention them in media interviews and on his Twitter and Instagram feeds, which prompted fans to want to know more about these world-class athletes. It makes you think how powerful it would be if more high-profile Premiership footballers publicly supported the women's game and called out some of those trolls on social media. Some male allies have chosen to do even more than calling out the sexism they see and championing women's sport. They have also helped fund it. During the summer of 2020, when it became apparent that professional women's golf was going to suffer more than men's in the lockdown, Liz Young, a veteran of the Ladies European Tour, decided to set up her own tournament on her course, Brockenhurst Manor. Working with Liz to build on this idea, professional golfer Justin Rose established the Justin Rose Ladies Series with his wife Kate. Their management company, Excel Sports, ran the 2-month mini tour with 7 tournaments for British female professionals, and they each put in £35,000 of their own money for prize funds. I am keenly aware that I now have the opportunity to go back to work and compete on the PGA Tour, but this is not the same for the ladies and some junior tours as well, Rose told The Telegraph. I am sad that the Ladies European Tour has been suffering so badly and doesn't really have a start date yet from what I know. To me, that seems somewhat unfair. My wife Kate and I felt there was an opportunity to step up and help. The prize money is modest because it is me throwing in some money and then the ladies are paying an entry fee and being able to play for a pot. We wanted to give them the opportunity to play and be ready for when the opportunities arise later in the summer. Following Justin's support, other partners came on board, with American Golf and CompuCenter contributing funding and Sky Sports agreeing to broadcast the series. Formula One has long been seen as a traditional boys' club, with Bernie Ecclestone, the former CEO, dismissive of female drivers, once saying women should be dressed in white, like all the other domestic appliances. Fortunately, attitudes are now changing. Step forward, former Formula One Grand Prix winner David Coulthard, a male ally who is making a huge contribution. Coulthard is the advisory board chairman and consultant for the W Series, a groundbreaking racing series for women that launched in October 2019. The goal of a W Series is to shake up the industry, push aside stereotypes, and change the face of motorsport. Believing that women can compete equally with men in motorsport, the organisers felt that an all-female series was required first to ensure greater female participation. In its first season, the W Series provided identical F3 cars for 18 female drivers who had all passed a rigorous pre-selection programme. The drivers from across the world competed on 6 European circuits, with the series broadcast on Channel 4 in the UK. Coulthard has very publicly declared his unwavering support for the W Series, saying, "I personally want to bring more women into motorsport. My sister raced. She was very good but didn't get the support because my family was supporting me, and I regret that. So I want to be part of this to help support female talent and bring more women into motorsport. If they're good enough, they'll go to Formula One. If they're merely good, and good is still good, then they'll be in touring cars, sports cars, and many other championships." Following the announcement that in 2021 the W Series would feature as support races for 8 Formula One Grand Prix weekends, another male ally stepped forward. Lewis Hamilton told the BBC that this link-up was crucial to improving diversity in the sport. When we talk about diversity, people often think we're talking about having more people of colour. It's not just that. It is having more women involved. It is a male-dominated sport, and that does need change. I remember racing on the way up and seeing less than a handful of girls coming through. I spoke to a couple of them and knowing how difficult it was. I raced with Susie Wharf, who was such a great talent, and saw how tough it was for her in what was perceived as a man's sport. The sport does need to do more, and that is a good step in the right direction, but it needs to transcend all the way down to karting. There need to be more girls in karting with more opportunity to make their way up to that class. They need to do more to make sure the young girls out there know it is a possible career path, and hopefully that's what W Series is going to do. High-profile male athletes with influence and reach can have an immense impact in shifting the language and perception of women in sport. But it's key that male allies exist across the entire sporting landscape. While there's a big debate to be had about parachuting men into management roles in women's sport and how this negatively impacts the opportunities for women, there's no doubt it can also help bring increased credibility and much-needed profile to women's sport. Whatever your opinion of Phil Neville's appointment as manager of the Lionesses in January 2018, and there certainly are lots of opinions, when the FA chose a well-known male professional footballer for the role, they ensured that women's football would be taken more seriously by men. We may not like that fact, but it's true. Men in these roles can use their influence to redress the balance of gender equality. Another man leading an England women's team was Mark Robinson, the former coach of the England women's cricket team. Interviewed about his role as a man managing women for the NatWest podcast Championing Women's Voices, he recalled that when England's cricket teams travelled to compete in the World T20 in India in 2016, the men flew business class while the women's squad sat in economy. The International Cricket Council had decided to pay for better seats only for the men. The following year, the England women joined their male counterparts in business class. Sometimes it just needs somebody else to raise the bar and shame people, he said, before sharing his shock at the inequalities faced by women cricketers when he first became coach in 2015. Kit that they received from sponsors did not fit as it was made for men. The shorts looked dreadful. Managers at the England and Wales Cricket Board shrugged it off. But I kicked off. That's the male ally role. If you want to create equality and respect, you need to see the world from a woman's point of view. Men at the very top of a sport have great power to change the game for women. The WNBA became the world's most successful women's sports league because of the likes of NBA Commissioner David Stern, who sadly died in 2020. Stern recognised the commercial potential of women's basketball and worked incredibly hard to ensure the growth and success of the WNBA, which has continued to flourish in a world where many professional women's sports leagues have failed. Val Ackerman, the WNBA's first president, who I was lucky enough to meet at a leaders' conference at Twickenham Stadium in 2019, said that the two most important figures of the second half of the 20th century when it came to advancing and empowering female athletes were Billie Jean King and David Stern. After Stern's retirement in 2014, Val told ESPN, without his vision and engagement, the league wouldn't have gotten off the ground. He was the mastermind, and the WNBA was really in line with his vision about how sports and society are intertwined. The current WNBA president, Kathy Engelbert, echoed those sentiments as she commented on how saddened the organisation was by his death. The WNBA will be forever grateful for his exemplary leadership and vision that led to the founding of our league. His steadfast commitment to women's sports was ahead of its time and has provided countless opportunities for women and young girls who aspire to play basketball. Similarly, in rugby, Sir Bill Beaumont, reappointed chair of World Rugby in 2020, has had a significant impact on the gender balance at the very top of the game, and this is now filtering down to the entire sport. Before 2017, there were no women on the Global Governing Bodies Council. It was Beaumont who added the 17 additional female posts on the World Rugby Council, leading the way with such a significant change to its setup, the first of any major sporting federation. They told unions and regions that they could have an extra seat at the council if the new member was female. Beaumont has also been the public face of male support for women in the game. He was front and centre at World Rugby's launch of the Women in Rugby #TryAndStopUs campaign in 2019 and was also very vocal when the sport announced a move to gender-neutral titles for major events, with what was the Women's Rugby World Cup, now to be known as the Rugby World Cup. It is not just those at the very top of elite sports who can have a significant impact. I have been lucky enough to meet some fantastic male allies throughout my career, men who are happy to stand up and shout about women's sport, who recognise that a world where women's sport thrives is better for everyone. These would include men like Tim Hollingsworth, the Chief Executive of Sport England, Brett Nichols, CEO of Get Berkshire Active, and the male trustees of the Women's Sport Trust, Tim Cos-Young, Chris Hurst, Michael Inpong, and Ben Smith. Misha Sher, Vice President of Sport and Entertainment at Mediacom, has been hugely vocal about the potential for women's sport. Supportive on a very practical level, he has promoted the female athletes he represents, such as footballer Eni Aluko, and brokered deals in women's sport, including Boots sponsorship of the women's national football teams of every country in the UK and in Ireland. Harlequins Rugby Club's passion for ensuring equality for their female team has been impressive to see, from the shared training facilities and coaches through to the women receiving equal billing in marketing materials and on signage around the stoop. This comes from the very top of the club, with owner Charles Gillings recognising the importance of the women's game and his commitment to equality filtering down throughout the club. Other male allies in women's rugby include Johnny Hammond, the voice behind the Women's Rugby Pod podcast with co-host Rachel Burford, rugby pundit Hugo Monnier, commentator Nick Heath, Premiership Rugby's Paul Morgan, a former editor of Rugby World magazine who has been a massive ally supporting and reporting on the women's game from its earliest days in the 1990s, and Stephen Jones, rugby correspondent at the Sunday Times, appointed Director of Women's Rugby at my local club in Maidenhead in early 2021. Male broadcasters can do much to reinforce the credibility of female sport, something that Brian Moore has always done in his Full Contact podcast, which regularly features female players and reports on the women's game. Will Greenwood and Rupert Cox also show great support for female players on Will Greenwood's rugby podcast. Other men leading the way in bringing big brand sponsorship into women's sport include Tom Corbett at Barclays and Nick Reed, Kenneth Kropman and Neville Kupovitz at Vitality. These are just some of the men I have come across in my own work, but there are thousands of others doing incredible work to drive equality, sometimes very much under the radar. Having male allies in sports media also has a powerful impact. It was Adam Sills, head of sport at The Telegraph, who worked so hard to create Telegraph Women's Sport. As Anna Kessel, women's sports editor, said, "Everything I've asked of Adam, he said yes to. He's been an incredible boss. It was his idea. He spent 18 months bringing this together, finding the finance for it, getting backing from the company. He did that incredibly difficult groundwork which nobody could see, so he wasn't getting any thanks or praise. I turned up. On the day that we launched it, it was my first day, stood on the stage, and everyone went, 'This is wonderful.' And I hadn't done anything at that point. It just goes to show that when you invest in something and you put the time into it, you care more about it. That's why it's important, not just to leave that work to women, but for everyone to get involved." In terms of broadcasting too, there are men like the BBC's Adam Mountford, working quietly behind the scenes for decades to ensure the BBC's cricket coverage now includes a host of superb female voices, including Ellie Oldroyd, Ebony Rainford Brent, Alison Mitchell, and Issa Guha. and former professional footballer Ian Wright, who has emerged as a very vocal supporter of women's football, both as a pundit and through his social media accounts. It was a Daily Record journalist, Stan Shivers, who propelled a young Rose Riley to a professional career in Europe. Rose told me that she used to read the back pages of her dad's newspaper and dream about Real Madrid and whether they might have women's professional teams. She saw the name of the journalist, Stan Shivers, who wrote the articles for the national newspaper, and headed off to meet him. Unannounced. She was just 16. I went to the offices up in Glasgow, gigantic offices, and the secretary said, "Can I help you?" And I said, "Yes, I have to speak to Stan Shivers." She asked if I had an appointment, and I said yes, which I hadn't. She took me to his office, and there was this sophisticated gentleman smoking a cigar, and he looked up and he said, "Can I help you?" I said, "Yes, my name's Rose Riley and I want to play professional football." I told him my story and he said, "I'll try to help you." Stan got back in touch with Rose a few weeks later to tell her he'd found a semi-professional team in France called Stade de Reims. And that was it. Stan made the introduction to the team and the newspaper even paid for the airfares for Rose and fellow footballer Edna Nealis to fly out for trials with Stade de Reims. Rose went on to become one of the most celebrated female footballers of all time. I can never thank Stan enough. I kickstarted him to kickstart my career. It was amazing. A simple act that demonstrates the power of a male ally. Male allies aren't just the high-profile athletes or senior men working in sport, though. Dads, brothers, husbands and boyfriends can all play a huge part in celebrating and normalising women's sport for the females in their lives. It will often be my husband, Matt, who voices his frustration at a BBC 5 Live sports roundup that contains no mention of women's sport. I'm sure him seeing it's an issue and expressing annoyance means much more to my daughters than my pointing it out again. I grew up in a very active family where sport was constantly on the television. While my dad, Roy, a physical training instructor with the Metropolitan Police, certainly held many societal views I didn't agree with, when it came to women taking part in sport, I never felt that my participating and competing was any less important than that of my 3 brothers. He normalised women's sport, celebrating female athletes alongside males. I'm sure that gave me the confidence to make sport a big part of my life. What can men do to be good allies? I've learnt so much from the Black Lives Matter movement recently, and one of the things that's powerfully resonated is the need to be anti-racist rather than non-racist. I think it's the same for men encouraging women in sport. Good that you are non-sexist, but what we really need is more men in the sector who are anti-sexist. The word ally should be seen as a verb rather than a noun. It is not enough to say you don't exclude women or that you would support women's sport if you saw it. Change will come when more men call out sexism when they see it, when they make a point of actively supporting women's sport. Not just ignoring the trolls on social media who make stupid remarks about female athletes or women commentating on sport, but stepping in to challenge them, however exposed that makes you feel. Not settling for the inequality in funding or coverage from your organisation, but asking questions and being a voice for women in sport when you're in meetings. We live in a society which, in many ways, has normalised men's right to ridicule women for their performance or ability. This is hugely apparent in the world of sport, where derogatory remarks about women, be they athletes or journalists, seem somehow socially acceptable. Too many men feel this is a normal thing to do, and the era of social media has magnified this with thousands of anonymous men hidden behind keyboards spitting out nasty comments about women. Whenever I see mean comments from men on the Game Changers Facebook page, it always reassures and surprises me when other men step in to call out the negativity posted. It is a great reminder that there are lots of regular men out there who recognise the value of women's sport and women working in the sports sector. So how can more men become allies in women's sport? The Tucker Centre for Research on Women and Girls in Sport makes several great suggestions. Be vocal. Speak up if you see inequity. Celebrate female athletes and female leaders. Create a culture that values and supports women. Educate yourself and others. Learn about the barriers girls and women face in sport. Review and question policies and practices. Reflect on and address your own personal bias. Promote female leadership. Mentor, sponsor, champion and employ women. Invite women to apply and communicate opportunities. Use your power to advocate for women. To the men who already show their support for women's sport, we thank you. To the others, please do stand up and use your voice and influence to help bring about equality to sport because, as Moya Dodd says, our legacy is not how we're judged by our peers, but how we are judged by our grandchildren. Thank you so much for listening to the serialisation of my book Game On, The Unstoppable Rise of Women's Sport. If you'd like a copy, it's available in hardback and paperback in all good bookshops and online. The Game Changers podcast is free to listen to on all podcast platforms. Head over to fearlesswomen.co.uk to find out more about all of the incredible game changers I've spoken to in previous series. There are over 100 of them, including elite athletes, journalists, coaches, scientists, broadcasters and CEOs. As well as listening to all the episodes on the website, you can find out more about the Women's Sport Collective, a free, inclusive network for all women working in sport. And you can register for the Fearless Women newsletter, a weekly review of the global developments in women's sport. Do come and say hello on social media, where you'll find me on LinkedIn, Instagram and Twitter at Sue Anstiss. Finally, if you've enjoyed the podcast, I'd be so grateful if you could do two things. Firstly, if you could leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, I'd really appreciate it. And secondly, if there's anyone in your life, at home or at work, who you think might enjoy the podcast, please do let them know about it and help us spread the word about women's sport and the stories of these incredible game changers.